Welcome back. I'd like to welcome back our previous guests from yesterday and our returning guests from yesterday and our newcomers who are joining us for the first time today during this conference, both in person and online. Welcome back to the 5th Annual Renewable Energy and Sustainability Conference. So this morning, our first speaker, we have the esteemed pleasure of welcoming Rico Frias. He is a member of the Chihene Nation. He is Executive Director of Native American Finance Officers Association. Also with him is Nicholas Lovesee. He is the Senior Policy Advisor of the same organization, the Native American Finance Officers Association, aptly named NAFOA. Okay, so they'll be going ahead and giving us their presentation over the next hour, and I believe we're ready to go. So, Rico, I'll hand it off to you.
Good morning. Pleasure to see you all. Welcome to Florida. It's always good to be here, especially in winter. It was like 28 when I left Maryland, so it's good to be here. My name is Rico Frias. I'm the Executive Director of NAFOA and Royal Citizen of the Chihene Nation. I'm also an attorney. I've been in this position about 1.5 years now, so someone asked me when I came in this morning, I'm still sort of the newish Executive Director at NAFOA. And I have to make one correction. When we sent over the slides, Nick was our Senior Policy Advisor, and now he's our Director of Policy at NAFOA. He does an outstanding job for us, and we really appreciate his work. So,
probably against the advice of everyone else on the board. So I appreciate the promotion. That can possibly make a difference. My name's Nicholas Lovesee. I am the Senior Policy, Director of Policy now. You can tell how I'm still not used to the position. I want to thank everyone for being here. Before this, I actually worked as the only lobbyist for E&I, the Italian energy company. So energy is something it's a topic that I really, really enjoy. My poor, long-suffering wife knows that anytime anything remotely energy-related gets brought up, she's in for a 30-minute discussion on market, sanctions, anything that's coming in my mind. So she wasn't even willing to look over this presentation for me because of how much she has to listen to that kind of thing. So, but we want to thank everyone for being here. Before we get started, can I ask how many people here have energy? Ask a raise of hands. So I'm going to assume everyone else has absolutely no energy experience whatsoever. You're just coming into this. One thing I highly recommend, Daniel Jorgen, he wrote a book called The Prize. It's about oil and gas, and I understand this is a renewable energy conference, but if you want a good background on really how we got to be where we are today, as far as the energy markets go, as far as the regulatory markets go, as far as how the United States government developed the positions that it has and why it has those positions, sort of the history behind it, I highly recommend, if you get a chance, check it out on Amazon, The Prize. Really recommend it. So what we're going to do is we're going to get started. We got 2 main goals for assuming the PowerPoint catches up with us.
The meeting codes?
Yes, I.
well, while we're waiting for the PowerPoint to catch up, one of the things that we strongly believe at NAFOA, right, is that we believe in economic diversification. It's really important for us to diversify our economies. We all know that. We think energy can be a great tool for doing that. Renewable energy can be a great tool for that. Although we are agnostic around energy at NAFOA, meaning we don't choose between renewable energy and extraction, right? We believe that's up to those of you who are working within your tribal governments, your tribal communities. That's for you to choose, right? It's not for us to tell anybody what they should do on their home to take care of their tribal members. So we maintain that that viewpoint on energy. But there's a lot of benefits that can flow to the community from them. So, and Go ahead.
So getting into, we've really got two goals for today. One, we kind of want to talk about what we've learned at NAFOA, working with tribal governments, tribal administrators. NAFOA wasn't traditionally in a whole lot of the energy space prior to the past year and a half. Like Rico, I also came in July of 2021. So when we say year and a half, that's why we keep making that reference. It's kind of an arbitrary date. But we want to kind of share sort of what we've learned. Oh. I'm sorry?
So NAFOA is, he wanted a high level of what NAFOA is. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, we are a national intertribal organization. We started out as a member organization of individuals, right? People who are involved in tribal finance, accountants, other people working within tribal finance. We've been, this is our 41st, I almost said 44th. This is our 41st year in existence.
No, just the switch is the only thing. It's not that. It's something else.
I'm sorry. I'm hearing feedback from a microphone. Sorry. So I thought somebody was asking a question. And so, but now we are an organization. We have 157 tribal members, right, made up of tribal governments, and we promote sound economic development, right, strong tribal economies, and sound fiscal policies, and that's what we do. It sounds like you might be from across the water a little bit. There's, and the reason I mentioned a little bit. The reason I mentioned I have a meeting later today with a colleague from Aotearoa, from New Zealand, from our sister organizations over in New Zealand, which is a Maori Finance Officers Association or something similar. I'm talking about the World Conference in 2024, which will be in New Zealand, and 2027, which will be here, and then next week, our sister org, AFOA, Aboriginal Finance Officers Association, which is in Canada, has a conference. But that's what we do at NAFOA, and so we have two sides. We have our policy side, where we try and influence policy with the federal government, and make strong policies on behalf of Indian country, whether it's related to energy, tax reform, economic development, access to capital, those sorts of things. And then on the other side, on our educational side, we try and encourage more Native youth to get involved in the careers of accounting, economics, and finance, right? We have a lot of, since, UNM started their program and brought the first person out in 1972, and they had two Native youth, one of whom was John Echohawk, coming out of the program and becoming Native lawyers. We have a much higher turnout of lawyers. When I'm a lawyer myself, that's why I know this. And we still need lawyers, right? There's always going to be something to sue the feds over. That's not going away. But we need people to do other things as well, right? We need people. Are you from the feds? I'm sorry. You got like a pained look on your face. I was like, oh, I'm sorry about that. For our friends from DOE, we don't really mean you necessarily, but because I think there are some DOE people coming. But we need people to manage our money and to watch our money and to fill other roles within our tribal governments, right? Nothing against the allies that have been working with us and supporting us, but we need to fill these places with our own youth. So that's the other side of what we do at NAFOA. So just that's as brief as I've ever been about anything in my life. So we'll get back into our presentation because I'll burn the next 20 minutes if. I can see Nick leaning forward and trying to get my attention again, so he can cut me off.
No, I appreciate it, because you're right. That's a good, quick question.
Absolutely.
So what we've really been focusing on is trying to help people ask the right questions as far as how energy works, how there's different projects available for different tribal governments, for different levels of financing, for different needs, for all kinds of things. But we really are focusing on, like I said, helping people figure out what questions to ask. Because one of the hardest things when you get into a new industry or assigned a new project or anything is even learning what are the right questions to ask, much less before you can even start to get the right answers. So we've been trying to help people, A, learn that, and then B, get a complete snapshot of the energy industry as well. Anyone who's ever done, for example, boxing or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you can spend all day teaching someone how to do, for example, an armbar. But if you don't learn how to do the wrestling part, how to maintain a position, how to advance that position, it doesn't matter if you just know one section of it. All right? So there's a lot of webinars, and NAFOA's done a number of them, very good webinars that, for example, will talk about one program. But if you don't see how that one program fits into the broader energy market, then it really doesn't do you that much good if you just know a lot about one program. I mean, you don't know how the roads from your tribal government are going to connect to that. You don't know how's that going to interact with the rest of the energy markets. You don't even know how that's really going to affect the financing. So we've tried to give people sort of a complete approach to the energy markets. And then lastly, we've been trying to educate people on just what's out there. There's a lot more that's out there than I think a lot of folks expect. We started with just the idea of oil and gas and basic renewables, for example, wind, solar. But just as an example, some of the other things that we've worked with the federal government on are manufacturing, utilities, transportation, refining.
Before we get too far on that, one thing I did want to say is this sort of came out of the presentation, and what Nick's talking about came out of the discussions he had with the different departments in the federal government, right? Energy, Interior, Commerce, and how to, and an idea he had of like looking at how you could fit all these programs together and make them work. And some of them do work alongside each other. Some of them can be used for matching funds. Not many, but there are some that can be used in that way. And so the idea was to put the pieces of the puzzle together in ways that could work and look beyond just one program at a time, but bringing them together and using them together in that way. And just the other thing I want to say before we get too far on what Nick was saying, you know, energy projects are complex. I think any sort of large infrastructure projects are complex, but we've entered into complex industries before and demonstrated our ability to learn them and really exceed at them, right? Gaming is a very complex industry. I remember talking to when I was in-house at the Pueblo Pewaukee, talking to their then treasurer, she's retired now, and she remembered selling pull tabs from the back of a pickup truck, and now they have this large, beautiful casino, Buffalo Thunder, right? And it's you know, from really humble beginnings to where they are now, right? Like, clearly, we have surpassed commercial gaming, right? We're the largest player in that industry. And we can do the same thing, I think, in any industry that we enter into if we take the time to learn the basics of it, understand, right? Get the right partners to help us with it, and understand like what we need to ask, what we need to be looking at in terms of size and scope and what's appropriate for our area. Right, Nick. Sorry.
Did anyone watch the State of the Union last night, or at least part of it? Okay, so then you would know, for example, the manufacturing was one of the parts that President Biden mentioned. He mentioned microgrids. That's something that we've been working a lot on, and we're hoping that people will be able to take advantage of in the not too distant future. But really what we want to do is we want to try and help people learn about, there's a lot of different federal programs out there for a lot of things that people don't normally associate with just the basics of energy, which would be, like I said, either solar, wind, oil, gas, just traditional extraction. Carbon capture is one of the more exciting ones that we've been working on with the federal government. And a lot of the programs, last thing I'll say on this, is a lot of the programs that will fund the more traditional type renewable or the traditional type extraction are also now interested in funding some of the other things. For example, Rico, you had a rare earth mineral one that you wanted to touch on specifically.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you all saw the news. I think I saw it on Monday that Department of Energy committed $700 million for lithium extraction in Nevada, which is a really large sum of money. We know that there are nickel, lithium, and other deposits on tribal lands. There's a man, his name is Mark Podlasley, and he works with the First Nations Major Project Coalition up in Canada. And he talks a lot about getting ready for the energy transition and the importance of getting ready for the energy transition. And he's got a really good outlook on it in the sense of that beyond, we don't want to be a passenger in this car, right? We know this administration is really, really excited about the transition to clean energy, and we know this is going to continue. There are major solar projects, and Nick mentioned this, in Republican areas now. It's not such a clear dividing line. So we don't want to be a passenger in the car. We want to be a participant. We want to be part of driving this car as we make this transition to net zero. And I think tribes should be looking at all the ways that they can participate in that, whether it's nickel, whether it's lithium, whether it's manufacturing of components related to wind and solar or batteries or other things that are involved in these technologies, that we really should be, because it's not that far off, and if we aren't looking at it, it's just going to happen to us as opposed to being drivers of this transition. So I think that mindset is really important. Something I wanted to, as we're looking at this, at the microgrids, the Pueblo Piqueries has, I think they're in the middle of their second microgrid. They did one for their economic development, and they're doing one for their housing. And so we can talk to our friends who've already been through this process and learn about how they did it and what they did to accomplish it, and take real positive steps to participate.
So now that we've covered some of the things that we, on an expanded level, want to talk about, how do you actually get started? First of all, you need to be able to assess what your tribal needs are. One of the most important things, and we've learned this from talking with everyone who's a consultant, and I'm going to have to end up calling on Merck Herding a couple of times because I saw him sneak in late, so that's why I'm picking on you. He was really, really helpful in the webinar series that Rico mentioned, and we'll get a little bit more into. But it was, again, a holistic look, kind of trying to tie in together the federal people, the financing people, and the consulting people, so that they could all kind of speak to their own experiences. One of the most important things that came away from that is, again, assessing your tribal needs. You don't build to a grant. So just because there's money out there for that you might qualify for, that doesn't mean that it's the right fit or the right thing for your tribal government. This one, I think, is one of the more important ones, and I don't mean don't build to your comfort as in how much financing you have, because you might be able to get more than what you feel good actually spending. I'm sure we've all bought a car and kind of had that feeling when we were buying it, like, is this really how much I actually want to spend? Would I be happier? Or maybe, house, any big purchase like that. I'm sure everyone here who's worked on any big projects had sat to some degree, especially when you start looking at the initial costs. But I don't mean just the cost of comfort. I mean, for example, how happy are you with having a non-tribal entity helping out with some of these projects? How happy are you with, for example, just the project itself? Do you feel comfortable enough in your tribal government that a microgrid project, like the people who are going to oversee it, understand enough to work with the consultants, the constructors, do they really understand it? Do they feel comfortable going into those meetings? Do they feel comfortable if something goes wrong, that they would be able to address it? Another good example, just one last thing. Another good example on comfort would be how comfortable are you with going out and searching for some of the different financing? How comfortable are you working with some of the different entities? Is this something, how much of your tribal money, time, and lastly, how comfortable are you working with your tribal governments that if you start one of these projects, there's not going to be a change, for example, in council that's going to want to totally change things over? That kind of internal tribal politics, how comfortable do you think the tribal politics would be with some of these projects? I know we've had a number that Rico and I have learned about over the past couple of years where, they start the project, spend some money on it, and then there'll be a major change in leadership that would just basically cancel everything. So that's the kind of comfort we mean. Rico, you.
Sorry, I moved back in my notes. When we're looking at major infrastructure projects, one of the things I think that's important to do is to really plan out the full scope of what you need rather than just what you can fund. And Nick was mentioning this. And I used to represent, when I was in private practice, a middle mile broadband provider, and they ran into this structure. And there's a lot of similarity in some of these things, in infrastructure projects in this way, in that they ended up with a network that was sort of like Frankenstein's monster in a way, because they kept building it as they got funds instead of making an overall plan for their project, for what they needed for their network, and then building what they could in manageable pieces that would be functional, right? And so you need to have the overall plan for the needs of your community, and then break that into pieces that you can make according to the funds that you get. Because it ended up costing them twice as much as it should have to build the network the way they did it, because they had to go back and redo things and tear things up and add pops and meet-me points and handholds and other things along the line that they should have designed in along the way. So I think that's when you're assessing your needs, and when he's talking about don't build a grant fund, that's what he's talking about. Look at the overall, what your needs of your community are going to be. But also look at what the goals are of this project for your community. Is it is it an economic engine really that you're trying to do to bring in governmental revenue? Is it job creation that you're looking at? Is that your primary goal? Or, and I have a colleague who works in this area, or is the goal of this project to lower costs for your community? One of the governors I worked under at Pewaukee, that was one of the goals for him for looking at doing a microgrid at his community. At the time, we weren't able to sell excess energy off to the major utility provider in the area. That's changed, I've been told, because of the changes in law for community solar, but it was an inhibitor in terms of that project. But if you're just trying to lower costs for your community or lower costs for your casino, then you might look at it a little differently. You might design it, you might plan it a little differently. So understanding what you want from the project when you get into it is really important.
Yeah, because tribes are in corporations. So, you know, when I worked for E&I, the object was to find projects that make the most money. I mean, some of them you might do in a country just because you're trying to get some favors for that. But at the end of the day, the whole point was to make money. Is your goal just to have workforce retention? Keep people, you know, on tribal land with happy with good paying jobs from an energy project. Also, what are your time horizons? You know, is this something that you need to do relatively quickly? Because that's totally going to affect the type of energy projects that are even available to you. Do you have like long-term horizons? You're willing to wait 30 years so that you can see returns for tribal members retiring? I mean, it totally depends on what your needs are. That's why it's important to create an energy plan. That's probably one of the first steps that anyone really should take after assessing what your needs are, is what's your plan, how is it going to address any? Don't let someone come in there and just sell you on a project. Like, this is the project we're good at, when you see that you get XYZ amount of sunshine, so therefore you need XYZ amount of solar panels, and bing, bang, boom. Is that really going to be addressing what your basic needs are? Then lastly, we got getting started continued. How will you go about seeking the funding? Once you've assessed that, well, what are your plans to actually get the funding? Do you know who you're working with? Do you know the reputation of the people you're working with? Are you going to involve the federal government? Are you going to be able to figure out what the building blocks are? We're going to get into that in a little bit. But you have to think of this almost like a puzzle that you're going to put together. You know, some programs allow you to do X, other programs allow you to do Y, and then some of them let you do Z. So how are you going to be able to fit them together, whether it's the initial step of the assessment, whether it's the actual construction, whether it's the maintenance, and then some of it can help you shut out the lights, depending on the project. So you really need to kind of figure out how you're going to plan out those building blocks. Lastly, on these sort of things, you need to get the right staff into the right position. This one I was a little bit surprised by. We worked with, as Rico mentioned, some of the departments, Treasury, Interior, Commerce, and I know I'm forgetting someone. Yes, Energy, obviously. It's funny enough I would forget Energy at this thing.
That one's your favorite. How could you forget them?
Yeah. But interestingly enough, the number one thing they all said was you need to have the right staff in the right positions. More than anything dealing with their individual programs, more than anything dealing with like the type of project they wanted you to construct that would most kind of fit their ends politically at the current moment, more than anything like that, they said have the right people in the right positions. And that's going to be really hard because the overlap between energy folks and people who understand tribal affairs, that's not a big Venn diagram with a lot of overlap. So, and I understand that it's rough and there might even be a little bit of overpaying, but even if it's just a matter of finding someone who in the tribal government's willing to raise their hand, learn about this, take some time, you know, that's really what it's going to take. You need to have someone on the inside who understands what questions to ask, understands what the eventual goals are. And then they can help teach the other members. Obviously, it's not going to be, you know, fully in depth. They're not going to know as much, but they can at least inform up and inform below on, look, this is why it's going well. This is why we need to improve X, Y, Z.
And that's really, I mean, that's how we, going back to gaming again as an example, right? That's what we did in the gaming industry. We brought in consultants, we brought in people from outside, and we learned the industry, and we filled those positions ourselves, and then we really took it over. And I think we can do the same thing here. We may need some help in the beginning. I mean, we already have, a number of tribes that are active in energy production, and we talk a lot in Indian country, right? And I think that's a really important part is talking to them and seeing how they got started, seeing who they used, the good and the bad, right? I think what worked for them, what didn't work for them. One of the things we know is DOE has a lot of they have a lot of studies that they funded through grants that have not turned into any projects, and looking at those, I always wonder, is it that, was it the consultant that helped them do these studies knowing that it wasn't really going to turn into a realistic project? Was it the scope was wrong? Was it, they didn't have the staff in place like Nick is mentioning? Why do we have all these studies on energy from these DOE grants, but very few energy projects? And I know it's, the energy wants to know as well, even the Loan Programs Office, since they've had their solicitation out, I know they're very eager to get projects started, and we've talked to them a number of times about trying to get loans started. It was a question when I testified at the House last year in support of that program. It was one of the questions we got from a Democratic congressperson, why they should continue to fund the program when we haven't done any loans. And, there's no easy answers to that. I mean, they didn't fund the program for 12 years, and that was part of it. And then the pandemic is another part of it. But I think there's also such a steep learning curve, and I think there's some hesitancy sometimes to move into this industry. But I do think there are real benefits for tribes. Sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say the last thing on that, building on that is, unfortunately, the reality is you have all the problems of a major energy project combined with all of the traditional problems of building any kind of tribal project. And that's just, the reality. Unfortunately, it's not something like an E&I that's a company that's just created solely to do energy. That's all they do. End of the day, they understand. So you got, for example, the tribal land issues. You have different regulatory issues that a regular non-tribal company would have to face. So it really is kind of sometimes you get the worst of both worlds, unfortunately. But that's just how it works. So, but to address that, one of the things that NAFOA did is we did a project, solving the project puzzle. This is the webinar series that Rico mentioned. Like I said, I want to thank Mark for all the help with this. They were very, very generous with their time. But what we did was we did a week-long webinar series. The first one was 2 hours because it was the 4 federal departments. We talked with them, we talked with the energy consultants, and we talked with financial advisors. Because again, first of all, I want to make it perfectly clear, and I understand this. You can't, even in a week with 10 hours of webinar, ever address all of this. You can't address all the questions, you can't address all the situations. Ironically, one of the funny things about when I say asking the right questions, you can understand what the right question is, but each tribe, because of their own situation, is going to have a different right answer. Depending on your location, depending on the number of members, depending on your financial situation. But what we did want to do is start to kind of, again, bring everything together at once. Like I said, you get a whole lot of the usual suspects sort of thing, where the Department of Energy might give one webinar on the LPO program, which is a great program. I highly recommend, we'll talk about it in a second. I highly recommend everyone look into it. The only problem is if you don't know, how to combine the financing on your own side and how to combine, working with the consultants, it doesn't really, it's a nice step in the process, but it doesn't really get you anywhere closer to the end result if you can't put the rest of those blocks together. A couple of the other things that were mentioned, what's your tribal business structure? Who will actually be making the decisions around the project? That was one of the things that a lot of people talked about. You need to make sure that the people who are actually going to be making the decisions understand what the impact of those decisions are going to be, why they're making them for that reason. That's probably just as important as what the actual decision is going to be. So that was one of the things that we tried to do. I have to say, I'm not going to pretend that everyone got a whole lot out of it. I'm going to say this, though. As someone from energy, I really enjoyed it. I could have done it for 10 weeks because I mean, you get me started talking about energy, and you'll never get me to stop. But I think you had a couple comments on that you want to bring up from the NAFOA experience on this, too.
Just that actually, I mean, everyone may not enjoy it as much as Nick does, but the feedback we got on the webinar series is really good. And I'm not making fun of Nick when I say that. We all have our things. If you get me talking about business structures, I'll be here all day long, because that's what I did as a lawyer, and I love it. And my wife's also a lawyer, and I start talking about it, her eyes glaze over, and she starts opening her phone and going to Amazon and trying to be subtle about it so she doesn't offend me. But we all have our things that we get really excited about, and his is energy, and he's been great for us here at NAFOA in terms with his passion, but also his contacts and putting these things together and helping get information out. But the feedback we got from attendees on the webinar series was that it was really helpful as a sort of a beginning primer at looking at these things and looking at the ways that you can, sorry, I talk a lot with my hands, so I apologize if I'm going in and out, but at the ways you could put these different loan programs, these different grant programs together to build a functional program at your home. And that's really what we wanted to talk about, is that they can be made to work together effectively. And then there's people like Mark, and I think some others who take part in it, some of our other sponsors who were there. I'm sorry, I lost my other point that I was gonna say on that, but it still lives on our website. And so if you have any difficulty in finding it, feel free to reach out to us. Our emails are really easy. We're listed on the NAFOA page, and I think our contact's on the last slide. But that web series is still up there. It's free to go and look at it. We always do that with our webinars, and it could be for those of you who are new to energy and are looking at it, could answer some of your early questions, right? Again, it's not going to cover everything, but it's a good start.
One last thing I'll say on this slide, I appreciate that. One last thing I'll say on this, and I promise I'm not going to say too many nice things about the BIA, but they did give us the basic idea of this. The BIA Business Development Office came to me, and they wanted to work on something like this where they worked with the other departments. And I think over the past, like I said, year and a half really, but really more just a year, the administration's kind of had a different view on how they want the departments to work together on this. I know the White House Council on Native American Affairs has done a good job of trying to corral them together to actually, rather than keep them in their own little fiefdoms, sort of share information. So I just want to say that it was a good example of the departments trying to work together to be able to make one thing rather than each of them just promoting their own programs to try to get ahead of some of the others. And I think it's important that they actually do get their due for being the ones to bring us this series.
Is this where I get to talk badly about the BIA, though? Or
Yeah, I think
is that later in the slides? No. One of the things that I've heard, not going to talk badly about them, but one of the things that I've heard from tribal leaders over and over recently when we're talking about energy and talking about, making energy development more common in Indian countries, that one of the biggest hurdles for energy development in Indian country is the BIA and their regulations and how long it takes them to approve things. And I don't know, is anybody here from New Mexico? Well, so are you aware of the project with the county maintained roads up in Santa Fe County up north? I don't know if you guys are aware of that. It was an issue where there were roads on the Pueblos that were Pueblo lands, and it's just an example of how long the BIA takes to do things. It was Pueblo land, but the county maintained the roads, and so it was blocking access to homeowners, so they could neither buy nor sell homes in this area. And it really divided the Indian and the non-Indian community. So we went to BIA and we asked them, can you do, if we do our part quickly, can you approve a 5-foot by 20 easement in 30 days? And they said, no, absolutely not. There's no way we can do that. It's going to take us 90 to 180. And which is a ridiculous amount of time to approve a 100 square foot easement. It really is. And in the energy area, the reason I use that is in the energy area, we've heard the same thing over and over again from tribal leaders, is that the approval process to get, anything it needs, like a lease or new drilling, again, I know it's a renewable energy, but whether it's mining, anything, it takes so long. And we have a Native person at the head of Interior now, and we have a former tribal leader at the head of BIA, and we should really be pushing on them to modernize these processes and to speed up these processes while they're there. I mean, they're from Indian country, they're from us, right? We should hold them accountable to us to make changes within Indian country while we have a an administration that may not understand Indian country, but is at least is favorable to us, so to make changes that are helpful to us. I know, we're advocating for this on our end, and we'll continue to advocate, but I think it's helpful to them to actually hear from tribal leaders about these things. People, from within tribal governments, and say, like, this takes too long. Like, you need to modernize this. We have 2 more years, not knowing what the election will be while they'll be in office, and they should be making changes that make life easier for us. Right, and this is one of them that I hear about repeatedly. It just takes too long. And I saw some heads nod in the audience. I think some of you have had experience with that, and we're happy to be a part of those discussions to make life easier, so that we can take full advantage of what we of the resources that we have in our communities.
So following up on that, and speaking of taking advantage of resources, this is the kind of thing that going forward, I would like to be able to do a little bit more of connecting to energy projects. Because when we did that webinar series, we really did only have the time to focus on direct energy-related grants. Something like climate change, there's a lot of money out there to help with different climate change projects, grid resilience. I'll talk about it in a second, but the Grid Deployment Office has an excellent program. It's due March 31st, all of the applications. Really recommend everyone look into that. We'll get into that, but I highly recommend looking into that. Roads, there's money out there for roads, and if you're going to be building a project, you might as well take the money to build the roads to the project. I mean, as long as they got it. Workforce development. I don't think a lot of people tie workforce development money into energy projects, but it's just as important in my opinion, especially if you want to be able to bring people from tribal lands, And then lastly, there's a lot of technology investment and a lot of technology grants. Depending on the project you're doing, you might qualify for a number of those. Going back to the high-end manufacturing, I know there's sort of a traditional versus new age thought about manufacturing. Some people, when you say manufacturing, you're imagining like steel mills, Detroit, that sort of thing. But then you also have a lot of clean room manufacturing. And there's a number of energy programs that can also be used on high-end clean room manufacturing. So that's the kind of thing that we're saying. And lastly, changing over an existing building to green energy. That's another area. So what we really want to do is we're trying to kind of look into the other funding pieces and sort of, like I said, put together a complete picture. In my mind, it really is all about advancing the ball a few yards at a time. I understand that these things aren't going to be around forever, but as long as we can keep kind of moving that conversation forward. One of the good things about these webinars, they're open for anyone. We always appreciate it's not a members-only thing. We want everyone to be able to take advantage of it.
And Nick's absolutely right there. The biggest thing for us is about getting the information out into Indian country. And when you're looking at it, I just want to comment on one thing on the workforce development. There was a tribe in New Mexico that used Section 184 loans to build a housing development on its lands for its members. And as a part of that process, what they did is they formed a construction company to employ their tribal members. And so those funds were able to employ their tribal members, create a new form of economic development. And that construction company now builds houses on other reservations in other places. And so if we think creatively, we can use this to fund workforce development outside of necessarily just the project we're looking at, right? It's always, I think, important for us to think creatively. Let me move that out of your way there. You sure? All right, good deal.
So I want to make a few of the programmatic highlights. These were some of the things we talked about in the webinar series and then in other webinar series as well. I'm going to kind of spoil part of our ending of the presentation by saying one of the things that I really like about a lot of these programs now is the flexibility. That's one of the things that, as much as I'm not going to say a lot of good things about BA, I'm not going to say a whole lot of good things about Congress, because unfortunately I've had to spend my whole career there. But they've done a good job sort of understanding in the energy space that it's very hard to legislate something super specific and have it actually be useful or have it actually be something that you could take advantage of. One of the more flexible ones is the grid resilience. I know we've asked them a number of questions. For example, could you accept the money, even if you're not actually spending it on any construction, just to give to your tribal members and help them lower their energy costs? Because that's a form of resilience. They don't know. They're trying to figure it out. Like, that's not what the statute was intended, but it's vague enough and it's got enough flexibility. That's something that they could do. One of the great things about Rico testified before Congress on the DOE's loan guarantee program. Another very flexible program. It's energy source agnostic. You want to just, yeah, you mentioned earlier about the testimony.
What
Oh,
part?
yeah.
What part in particular?
Oh, I didn't know you wanted to go into that.
No. I mean, it was supposed to be a very bipartisan hearing. It was right at the beginning of the partisanship really ramping up in Congress. I was a Democratic witness, so the Republicans mainly ignored me, and the Democrats had questions for me, and they went back and forth at each other. But they're definitely the unfortunate thing right now for us. I mean, well, the fortunate thing is that the Dems aren't in control of the House, so they can't cut it. The Republicans might, though, right? It's a great program, and the Republicans have already taken shot at the IRA, I believe. It's not going to go anywhere in the Senate, but still it shows a willingness to roll things back. But it went from $2 billion to $20 billion. $20 billion is a lot of money for Indian country that's out there if we can start getting those loans made. And I think we have about 10 years to use that money. But they are definitely looking at this money and looking at the fact that none of it has been used, and now they aren't looking at the fact that they established a program in 2005 but didn't give any money for staff or to do anything until 2017. So, and then for the feds, it was like lightning fast, right? Within a year, they had staff, they had regulations, and they'd done their first solicitation. It took NIGC 4 years to do the same thing. But they aren't looking at those things. They're just looking at the fact that Indian country isn't using the money, and therefore Indian country doesn't need the money. It was the same dialogue that we heard at NAFOA with some of the CARES programs and the ARPA programs that were not being utilized quickly, is that, well, they must not need the money because they're not using it. And they don't look at the fact that you haven't funded our tribal governments appropriately for generations, and now you're throwing all this money at us with all these application requirements. And we know down the line, you're going to have all these reporting requirements. You're going to have all these requirements for compliance. You're going to want to come out and do audits, right? Commerce is talking. They reached out recently. They're going to come out and start doing audits of how the broadband funds were used and were they used appropriately. So we know that's going to come. So there's hesitancy on our part. Do we have the staff in hand to be able to use all of this funds, right? You've gone from a garden hose to the fire hose, and we're not using it. You're saying we don't need it. Absolutely, we need it. But we needed it for the last generation, the generation before that, to build our tribal governments like you promised you would when we signed the treaties. And so it's, on that program, it is important that we look at it. There may be other ways of doing it, right? Private finance and other things. There have been people who've started in the LPO program and then have gone out to do private finance. But any funds that are out there, I like to see them be fully utilized, because it's just like when you hit the end of your budgets if you work in tribal government, right? If you didn't use everything you had last year, well, they assume then you need less for this coming year, right? And it's the same with the feds. The feds are always happy to take money back from Indian country, and I want to see us use every penny they give us.
Speaking of COVID, I'm about to probably destroy my own point with these questions. Does anyone actually work with the federal government on getting some COVID funding for your tribal government? Any type at all? All right. Were the staff people you talked with new, relatively new, by the times that you did that? I'm going to take the one person who raised their hand as everyone had that experience. The reason I say that is because in D.C., a number of the people who were working with the federal government, they didn't have enough staff in order to scale up on the kind of money that they were expected to hand out. So they started, Rico and I, there's a saying in DC, they haven't even taken them out of the box yet. We had a number of staffers that hadn't even had the wrapping come off the box yet. And they were responsible for handing out all this money, but they didn't know anything about the area. And it's not totally the department's fault. Where are they supposed to get a sudden influx of, 200 staffers who know about Native American issues in DC of all places, especially in the kind of time scale that they had? So I just want to mention that. And then lastly...
Can I jump on that point really quick, not to derail you? Department of Treasury, which had a lot to do with administering those funds, had, when the first 6 months we were in our positions, had 4 Indians out of 87,000 employees. That's not even the 2% we represent out of the dominant society as a whole. And I know that because one of the 4 Indians, I knew all 4 Indians, and one of them told me... this is how many there are. We are it. You know all of us, all the Indians in Treasury. You've met us all, and which is pitiful, right? And we did a webinar with Treasury and IRA trying to get more natives into Treasury. Like, we need to permeate all the departments. It's important that we maintain the presence that we have within the interior, but we need to be everywhere. So that when they're making decisions about us, that they're actually talking with us and not just about us. But there are so many new people and they don't understand. I would say about this administration overall that they're very well intentioned and they want to do good things in Indian country, but they do not understand Indian country. And part of it is that the people who are advising this administration are mostly like civil rights people and civil rights lawyers, and they see us as another racial group as opposed to a political classification, right? As Indians, Morton v. Mancari established that we are citizens of other nations, even though it's in the Constitution, right? And it's in other places. They made treaties with us. You only make treaties with other nations. And so they made treaties with us because we are citizens of the nations that existed before the colonies became a nation. And so, but this administration doesn't understand this. And so we need to keep reminding them and keep educating them about this so that they, and help encourage them to bring in more people. The man for IRS, and I know this isn't a tax thing, but Telly Myers, he was the head of the Office of Indian Tribal Governments. He's retiring. And so I've been advocating that they should bring in somebody from Indian country, somebody who is a citizen of a tribal government, if you're going to talk about Indian tribal governments, rather than bringing somebody in who doesn't know, like his boss, who doesn't know anything about Indian country or tribes or why it's different or how we hold our land or the structures. And then maybe we'll get answer to some of our questions like, you know, whether our corporations that are tribally chartered share the same tax status as our governments and other things like that, because they don't even understand the questions at first when we get them. So that's why it's so important when you're dealing with these new people. Like sometimes you have to start at the very beginning and explain it to them, which slows down our ability to move forward.
I know we've only got a few minutes left, and that is, I just want to go into real fast Inflation Reduction Act just as an example of something. I mentioned you got all the problems of tribal governments combined with all the problems of a normal energy project. One of the interesting things is at least Congress started to learn about the tax credits. Normally, the developer could only get tax credits. Has anyone ever heard about the Inflation Reduction Act? All right, does anyone know about the tax credit section of the Inflation Reduction Act? Okay. One of the things about that, and it's going to be interesting to see over the next few months as the IRS and Treasury start to do the regulations. I don't know if anyone sent in the comments. They had a comment period a couple months ago on the tribal section. I'm hoping that that's going to be able to make a major change, and then we'll be able to kind of help the tribes take advantage of that rather than have to split it with the developers. The only other thing I'll mention on here is the loan guarantee program. Again, it's another example of the government trying to be a little bit more flexible. So I want to talk about a little bit about considerations and takeaways. First, energy projects aren't a one and done. It's not like building, for example, a community center where you only have to worry about maintenance after construction, that kind of thing. You need to think about the entire life cycle. And then frankly, you need to think a little bit past that. What do you know, what's the land, is the land going to be useful following the project? I mean, depending on the type of project you do, maybe not. That's something you got to think about. One of the important things that we had in our webinar series, and a lot of the experts would say this, is no energy project is better than a bad energy project. It's far better to not do something than to do something that you're going to end up regretting, because that regret could be on a pretty big scale.
Can I hop in with just one comment right there, and I'll try and keep it brief? Is that you know, we've seen this in casino development. I think we've all seen examples of something that is built so large for its market that it's impossible for it to ever be profitable, right? And they never pay themselves off. And so when we're looking at these things, it's better to build something that is the appropriate scale for where you're at, that will eventually turn into something that is making money and sustainable, than it's something that's just going to be a stone around your neck that's dragging you down. You know, you just have to have a realistic idea for what you can do and what you'll be able to eventually pay off, and then will turn into a profitable enterprise for you.
Yeah, stay within your comfort zone. I also want to give a few kind of long-ranging ideas that we've noticed. First of all, I mentioned how Congress, and especially the administration, they've been focused on flexibility. You might kind of see more programs coming out that also have that sort of general idea when they're writing them in mind. Unfortunately, that also means that 10 years from now, we're probably going to see the pendulum shift the other way, and they're going to be much more specific. Anyone that's worked in a lot of these things, you see it go from block grants back to individual grants, back to block grants. The pendulum always shifts. So what we have today with the flexibility, we might not have tomorrow. Speaking of might not having tomorrow, we're in the middle of an energy transition now. I would rather, again, people not rush into projects and not make a bad project, but understand that the opportunities that are available today, they might be last 5 years, 10 years from now. And, you know, President Biden last night, he was talking about 500,000 new charging stations. I know they want to have that done in the not too distant future. Someone's going to get a piece of that. You know, once those 500,000 are built, they're not going to need another 500,000 right away. So there's a number of things like that. And then lastly, and I think this is important to note, one of the things I noticed when I was with E&I is there's a real, the politics of energy has kind of shifted. When I started in 2016, if you went into a Republican office, they would almost try and talk you out of a lot of renewable projects. They wanted to make sure that you were still investing in traditional oil and gas. By the time I was about to leave, because a number of companies had conscientiously made the decision to put renewables in Republican districts, they were just as interested in what we were going to do, depending on what office you were with, on the renewable side. So understand that a number of the politics might have shifted. The other thing that's shifted sorry, is the impact, the market impact. There was an understanding in the Obama administration that if we can shift the market, then it doesn't matter what the regulators do. You're never going to be able to undo a market shift. Even if you do try to do a number of regulations, the market shift's going to eventually push it over. So if you really kind of see some of the new legislation coming out, understand that there's going to be sort of an idea to move the market more towards renewables if you're on the Democratic side. So that the underlying idea is it, so if you see a piece of legislation, it might not make sense on the surface, but the underlying idea is if we can shift the market ever so slightly, then it doesn't matter if the administration changes and changes the regulations at the EPA, Department of Energy, that kind of thing. But the underlying market shift's really going to be what pushes it over the goal, because that's going to be something that an administration change just can't undo easily. Rico, I don't have any last points before we turn it over for the last few minutes for questions.
I know we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to, make sure in case there were any questions or anything, allow time for that. Yeah, you in the sweater.
Hi, thank you for such a riveting presentation. Relative to the BIA funds that are being used to support some of the local energy projects in Indian country, has there been any discussion around some statutory changes to allow for Hearth Act type responsibility for developing utility easements in Indian country, allowing tribes to do the NEPA work on that, to kind of move that process along, simply because it's in tribes' best interest? And to your point, I really like what you had said around if you're going to be doing a BIA road project, right, consider the utility easement right away. Then you've kind of reduced that barrier. But I think, you know, so we had the shift, right, in the leasing law to allow tribes to do those things for commercial, agricultural, and residential. You know, I think the next progressive step is to have utility easements included in that Hearth Act responsibility.
I haven't heard any discussions along those lines, and I don't know. Have you heard anything, Nick? The way you're looking at me, I'm thinking it's no, but I haven't heard anything. But I think it's a great move, right? I mean, and to your point about roads, every time you break the surface of a road, you've basically ruined it, right? Before I became a lawyer, I did 20 years doing heavy highway construction, various forms, and we always put the utilities in before we put the gravel in and anything else after the dirt, so that it's in there in the ground. In fact, one of the really traditional pueblos in New Mexico actually has surrounded their traditional village with conduit, so that if at any point the elders decide that they want fiber to the village, they don't have to dig it up. It's all there. It's all just, they had to do some rehab in the area, and so they put it in the ground at that time, and so it's there, empty, ready to have fiber pulled through it, should the elders say yes. And that's the kind of thinking I think we need to be doing. And then you want to go ahead and see about
I would say one thing on the BIA especially, and that we work with a lot, is their general business development. The way I would start it is first see what specific things are out there, and not just related to the BIA, but like Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, figure out what's specific. And then build out from that to the general. And by the general, I mean what funds are available in the general that would allow you to be used on that. So I'm a big believer in, first you want to go for everything that can only be used on that. Because you never know if the next month you're going to have another project that the general funds doesn't have a specific program for, but the general fund program might be able to do. So I'm a big believer in going for the specific ones. I do believe that some of the business development on the BIA, but I would really, on the grid especially, have you got a chance to see the grid deployment offices? Have you seen their program? Because that might be something. Send me an email with a specific question. I'll be happy to look into it for you.
I don't think there is any, on the legislation part though, I don't think there's been any talk about expanding that in the way that you're mentioning. But I think it's an idea we should explore, right, and see to expand the ability of tribes. I mean, we're not children. We can handle these things for ourselves. We don't need the federal government to be paternalistic and tell us what we can and what we cannot do on our own lands. We managed it very well before they came. We can manage it very well now. And so I think a shift in that attitude overall to allow us to manage our lands completely would be, it's to their benefit, it's to our benefit. Just give us the funds to manage it, and we can do it best for ourselves.
Right, and I think if DOE and some of those other funding agencies were to adopt programmatic and categorical exclusions for doing some of these projects, it would really pave the way. Because one of the things, of course, that you get hung up on, right, is the NEPA process and then the clearances and the approvals. So that would really make things, that's what we're dealing with right now. It's like,
And what community are you from?
I work with the United Nations.
In New York? Oh, Wisconsin. Okay. Our president is Tina Danforth. She's Oneida, Wisconsin. I have a lot of friends up there. No, I agree. I mean, we're hoping to enlist some of the other departments in getting pushes for changes like what you're talking about. I mean, most of our tribal communities, we have our own thippos who know the land and know the resources and knows what's important better than anybody from outside the community. There was the Hunt Corporation was trying to put a power line through, I think, 6 communities in northern New Mexico, and it was opposed by some of the local environmentalists. And they took a very paternalistic and slightly racist attitude to say, no, you shouldn't do this. You should, you know, you're damaging the tribes. The tribes don't want it, and you should move it over here. And you know, one of the thippos stood up and said, like, you don't know what's on our land, and you don't know because you don't need to know. But I know what's on our land, and the changes you're suggesting would destroy resources that are important to us. And it really shut down those kind of discussions. But we hear that a lot, and this attitude is very pervasive still, that we need help from outside to be able to manage our lives, and it's really not true. We can handle all those things for ourselves. You know, we understand better than anyone what we need in our communities, you know, and that's why I say I wouldn't tell any community what they should or shouldn't do, because I'm not from there. I don't even talk within my own community, within my own people, about what we need and what we don't need, and those things, and the feds really need to adopt more of that attitude, I think. But it's an interesting idea, and I'd be interested in exploring it more. I think we're out of time, so I want to say, thank you for listening, laughing at our jokes, for your attention. Nobody obviously fell asleep, which often happens with my low voice.
Oh, that's good.
So,
thank you, Rico. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you very much for that very thorough. Yes, let's give it up for them. Yes, thank you.